Hey everyone, Hannah here again, and I'm sure you're probably sick of hearing my voice at this point, but I promise after week one, there'll only be one video from me each week. So, this is the lecture. Just as a reminder, if you go to the week, this will be the video and where I'm putting the video that I'm creating right now. And then there'll be a PowerPoint to sort of follow along. All right. So without further ado, let's get into the lecture. All right. So we're doing classical theory. One thing that I think is important when a class is cross-listed, like ours is between Soc and Women's and Gender Studies, is we need to make sure that regardless of whether you're enrolled in the Soc or the Women's Studies side of things, you got to know about each other's sort of paradigm and framework, right? That's important. And so while this class is rooted in sociology, it was originally offered by sociology, and you'll see that that is foundational to how I've organized the class. It's so important to make sure that everyone understands everything. I have found in the past, if I don't do this, there'll be some topics we cover where sociology students are like, wait, what? I don't know what intersectionality is. Or the women's and gender studies students will be like, wait, who's Durkheim? Who's a classical sociological theorist. And so even though some of this stuff might seem very elementary, Soc 101 or WGSS 101 to you, for your peers who are in the other side of the class, it might be the first time they've heard some of these terms. So, and also it can be a good refresher, right? I imagine most of you are seniors and haven't had classical theory since your freshman year. So hopefully there's a little bit of review as well. All right. So today we're going to go over a syllabus review. We're going to do a Soc overview, then a WGSS overview, and then I'm just going to remind you to do the anonymous feedback, and you'll see that the link to that survey, in addition to being on the LaLima page, is also on your PowerPoint for the week if you're following along. Okay, syllabus review. How you're graded. All right, so a quarter of your grade is based off of the weekly discussion board posts, right? So do those, you get 10 points each time you do them. You can't make them up, but you do get an extra bonus 6 optional discussion board posts the last week of our semester if you've missed one. So hopefully that'll help give you a little wiggle room if you got to miss 1 week because you're out of town, out of the country, lose Wi-Fi, whatever, you get sick, that sort of thing. We'll also have a discussion leader project. The deadline for that depends on which week you sign up for. And at the end of this video, I'll actually go over that a little bit more detail. That's a quarter of your grade. Another quarter of your grade is your final paper, which is a literature review. And again, I already have a link on LaLima that covers what a literature review is and what components you should include in that. But around week 3, when I want you to start focusing on that final assignment in more depth, I'll provide a rubric. And of course, there's also a detailed description of all of these assignments, including the final lit review paper in the syllabus. And then the last quarter of your grade is split, 12.5% and 12.5%, between your reflection paper that's due week 2 and the power and control wheel assignment that's due week 3. For the reflection paper, you should already see a rubric for that assignment since it is due next week. And then you should also see a guiding document, which is a 5-paragraph essay model and how to organize that. Because this is a writing intensive class, I do provide extra sort of supplemental material regarding how to write papers, and that is the 5-paragraph essay document is one of those documents for the reflection paper. And there's also other information on LaLima regarding APA, ASA formatting, and things like that. So that rubric is available for you. And then for the power and control wheel assignment, I'll be posting that rubric next week. All right. Weekly assignments, just as a reminder, your individual discussion board post is due Friday at 11:55 p.m. on LaLima, and then your response to one classmate is due Sunday at 11:55 p.m., and you can either do a traditional response or you can create a meme, which I went over in one of my other videos for this week. Big assignments will always have rubrics. Weekly assignments, those discussion board posts, are essentially completion based. You complete those assignments, you're demonstrating that you're doing the reading and you're participating with your classmates, you're going to get full credit. Those bigger assignments, so the papers and projects and things like that, you will be graded based off of the rubric and the quality of work that you submit. However, I do allow rewrites if you need to do that, where we go back and forth and discuss revisions, and then you'll make those revisions and get regraded. And there are details about that process on the syllabus if that ends up applying to you at any point this semester. Just again, as a reminder, all of the due dates are found on the very last page of our syllabus, which includes a comprehensive class schedule, including what readings you should be doing, the weekly assignments, the big assignments, all that good stuff. Finally, should you have any questions about this syllabus, about assignments, deadlines, readings, anything like that, feel free to email me. If you're afraid to ask me directly, you can always submit a question in the weekly anonymous feedback, that exit pass that's linked every week, and I'll do my best to address those types of questions via email to the entire class so that you don't have to out yourself as the person asking that question in the anonymous feedback. I also demonstrated in another video for this week how to ask questions to your classmates if you need to do that. And I think before I move on to the sort of nuts and bolts of our lecture, I just want to show y'all, because I didn't really go over this in too great a detail, when you're signing up for your Discussion Leader Project Week, you'll go to the Start Here First page. You'll scroll down to Discussion Leader Project folder, student sign up, and you'll see that you're able to sign up for weeks 3, 4, 5, and 6. I'm providing supplemental material for weeks 1 and 2 to sort of give you all an understanding of what my expectations are. So you should have a lecture PowerPoint, you should have a video, and you should discuss the readings in depth to make sure that you're communicating to your classmates what the readings are saying, sort of like a bullet pointed list of what the readings are about, and your own interpretation of those readings. Right now, I allow up to 2 students to sign up for each week, but if my memory serves me correct, 2 additional students signed up at the last minute. So once you see that all the weeks are signed up, email me and I'll help you decide which week you should sign up for. So that will apply to the last 2 students who sign up for a week. We'll decide together which week we will add a third person to. Do note that if you do not sign up for a week by the end of week 1, on Monday, week 2, I will assign you a week. And so that'll be based off of need. Where do we need students to still sign up? You'll want to include your name, your first name, your last name, and your UH email account or address. And that, in part, is so that the other person who's assigned the same week as you can communicate with you via email, and you can ensure that the material you're including on your PowerPoint and video is different. You don't want to have word for word the same stuff, right? But again, I will answer questions about that as needed when we start to embark on that assignment. All right. So let's get back to the lecture. So basically for the sociology classical theory, I pieced together some different excerpts from theory textbooks that cover the 3 classical sociologists. So the first one is Smeltzer and Werner from 1976. It's chapter 7 of an anthology that covers classical sociological theory. And sort of the outlines of how this chapter is organized is the author talks about the sociological view of the world, competing social paradigms, human nature and social order, attitude toward conflict and knowledge and action, and then domain assumptions as theoretical axioms. So in terms of the sociological view of the world, we as sociologists should know that society is created by humans, by people. And so it's a very static thing. It's very flexible, and we learn about the social world from other people and from interactions with people. But we're not necessarily looking at individuals the way perhaps folks in other social sciences, such as psychology, do, right? We are not as interested in individual psyches as we are the way that groups of humans interact within a society. And that's the difference between sociology and psychology, very broadly speaking. This means that people as we know them are social products. So we are not just who we are because of, the way we were born, but actually social forces and social factors influence the things we like and the things we do. Social forces influence the way that we live our everyday lives, the food we eat, the language we speak, the clothes we wear, the jobs we have. All of those things we tend to view as individual choices, but in reality, we are very much influenced by the social world in which we live and our social products. And then finally, there's an objective reality of societies. And so again, this is just this idea that societies are socially constructed and social norms are socially constructed. And so what we think of as being good or bad or normal is really objective. And our reality of those concepts depends on the society in which we're raised. So the competing social paradigms. You should have read about Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. Those guys, those old dead white guys, are basically considered the founding fathers of sociological theory. And throughout the semester, we can sort of critique that, and we can think about, okay, well, why is it that classical foundational sociological theory is really only focused on white men, right? But for now, we do need to establish what those three guys contributed to our field of sociology, just to make sure that everyone's on the same playing field in terms of how they understand and they do understand what sociology means. And I'll cover those three different paradigms in more detail on the next slide. Right. So as far as human nature and social order, one of the questions we find ourselves asking a lot in the field of sociology is, are people autonomous actors, or are there social forces at work? Right, so this goes back to that stuff where, we tend to think of our choices as being these individual things that we weigh. But in fact, there are social forces at work all the time. And in this class, and especially next week, we'll be particularly interested in some of the systemic social forces that lead to privilege and oppression and marginalization within social institutions, which again, we'll cover in more detail what that means in week 2. Kind of a sneak peek. And then classical sociologists are always questioning what's natural and what is nature and what's human nature and what does that mean, because we can start to think about how it's socially constructed based off of the society you live in. And so there really isn't any normal way to be a human or a natural way to be. The idea of human nature is not something that sociologists really like to think about or even entertain. And this sort of engages feminist theory and classical women's and gender studies theory as well, because feminist scholars often find themselves challenging what social norms are or mean, especially as it relates to gender. In terms of attitude towards conflict and knowledge and action, again, this chapter focuses on Marx, Durkheim, and Weber and how they view conflict, and I'll go into more detail on that on the next slide. Okay, so finally, domain assumptions and theoretical axioms. This is the idea that we need to be connecting the social work with the scientific method and data collection. So the scientific method is something you probably learned about in elementary school or middle school. But we can start to think about how to apply this sort of very scientific way of thinking to the social world and to the social sciences. And so we collect data, and then we analyze that data, and we make sure that other people in our field are also interpreting our data that we're collecting in similar ways. And so it's not as though these theorists and scholars even today are, saying whatever they want randomly about the social world, right? These are ideas that have matured over decades based off of data that we've collected in the social world. And I believe the book goes into greater detail as far as quantitative and qualitative research. So quantitative research is looking at statistics and numbers, oftentimes survey data. Qualitative research, you're looking at words more, so interview data, content analysis of newspaper articles and other social media things. But we're analyzing these things to make determining thoughts and statements about the social world. And so these aren't opinions. When you talk about a theory or you talk about a scholarly journal article that you read for this class, this is not the author's opinion. Rather, it's information that has been gleaned from data that's been collected and analyzed. And so we start to think about what that means in terms of a theory of the way the social world is. And then, these excerpts were written in the 70s and 80s, I think maybe even in the 60s in some cases. So the language can be a little dense. I apologize in advance, but this will hopefully be one of the only times this is an issue. And so, axiom is not really a word that people would use nowadays. I just wanted to define that as statements or propositions that are established, accepted, or true, right? And true is in scare quotes because the idea of what is true or false, it can vary cross-culturally and is socially constructed. But this is what we mean when we're talking about the social world. We're not talking about opinions, we're talking about statements, propositions, and things that are established and accepted within a society as truth. All right, so as promised, here are Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, the theories that each theorist is associated with, and then a synopsis based off of the classical sociological theory experts of what these theorists did. So you got Marx and conflict theory. Marx was focused on class conflict and the haves and have-nots. There have also been contemporary feminist Marxists. So some things to point out. One, Marx is really not a sociologist. He's actually an economist looking at capitalism and things like that. But we sort of adopted him into the sociological canon. He and his work on conflict theory is oftentimes the classic sociological theory that students are most familiar with because a lot of other disciplines use his work. And it is the one that's most closely aligned with women's and gender studies because there is a more contemporary branch of conflict theory where feminists look at his contribution to haves and have-nots, or those with privilege and those with not privilege or oppression in terms of gender. And so that would be feminist Marxist theory. Next is Durkheim. He created structural functionalism and contributed to this theory. And again, that synopsis is, so instead of focusing on conflicts explicitly the way Marx did in conflict theory, Durkheim was more concerned with disorganization or a lack of norms and anomie. And so if you think about when Durkheim was writing, he's writing when the Industrial Revolution is happening. We're going from agrarian communities to capitalist society. And that didn't happen very smoothly in a lot of ways, right? Essentially all aspects of society were changing. So the types of jobs people had, how people were paying for things. People were moving from rural farms to urban areas where they could, work in factories and that sort of thing. This also impacted family dynamics. So it was beneficial when people were living in rural farms to have more children because those children could help with farm tasks, right? And there was a lot of space. So even though houses weren't huge the way rich people might have houses nowadays, you still had space to have a large family. Versus when you move to industrialization and you move to cities, there's physically, geographically, not a lot of space to have a lot of kids. So people quickly realize, I can't have 10 kids living on a farm. It doesn't make sense spatially. And then also, as we move to, pay money rather than trading in goods and that sort of thing, it's expensive to have kids in an industrial capitalistic society. right? But so Durkheim was interested in sort of this disorganization process that happens during this process of moving from farming and that sort of thing, and then the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. And then finally, Weber is associated with symbolic interactionism. So he's also concerned with conflict, but on a smaller micro scale. So rather than looking at these big social institutions, he's looking at how is conflict generated out of social interactions. So individual experiences people have in their everyday lives with each other. And then again, this is something that feminist scholars have also taken and worked on in a more contemporary setting. So Weston Zimmerman in the late 80s did a famous theory in women's and gender studies called Doing Gender, looking at how gender is being done in everyday social interactions, and we have a general idea of what masculinity and femininity should look like based off of our everyday interactions with other people in our society and how they perform or how they do masculinity and femininity, which again, of course, we should all know is socially constructed based off of the society and culture we live in. And it's always changing and evolving, right? The way that our parents' generation understood masculinities and femininities is different than our generation, right? Okay, now we're going to transition into women's and gender studies stuff. So what is intersectionality, which was the focus of the piece you read by Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality. So this is the way I define it. It's the interconnectedness of systems of oppression, looking at race, class, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, ableism, sizeism, as well as other isms and identities, and answering the question, how do all of these forms of oppression overlap and intersect? And so we can think about how they overlap and intersect in terms of our everyday lived experiences or our positionality. And then we can also think about these things on a larger scale, on a macro scale, based off of social institutions. So what does systemic racism or sexism or ableism look like in education or family dynamics, religion, things like that? Which I just kind of talked about, intersectionally applied. But again, you can start to think about these issues in your everyday lives. And then why intersectionality? So Kimberly Crenshaw's work came into being because she was reading a letter to an editor where a Black woman was really frustrated because she couldn't prove that the factory she worked at was discriminating against her because of race and gender. So at the time, the way anti-discrimination policy was written, you could sue a company if they were not promoting you because of the color of your skin or because of your gender. But this woman was saying, well, actually, it's not one or the other, it's both. I'm not receiving a promotion. I'm being targeted or treated unfairly at the factory I work at because of my race and gender. And so she's writing about this, and Kimberly Crenshaw reads this and is like, whoa, like, this needs further analysis. And as a legal scholar, I need to do something with this. She also was identified as a Black woman. And so that's where she starts to analyze policy and other social institutions in terms of intersectionality, or looking at how all of these different forms of marginalization overlap within our everyday interactions. So our interactions as employees at a factory would be an example, as well as within larger macro social institutions, right? So thinking about employment or policy as a social institution and how there wasn't really space for women of color to navigate the inequities that they were experiencing. All right. And then finally, another thing I usually discuss when I introduce students to intersectionality is the gender unicorn figure featured here. So this is this idea that when we're talking about genders and sexualities, they're not the same thing, and then we can break down those identities even further based off of gender identity, gender expression and presentation, sex assigned at birth, who you're sexually attracted to, and who you're romantically attracted to, as well as emotionally attracted to. So if you're unfamiliar with this, likely because you're a sociology major and not a women's and gender studies major, take some time to think about what this means, that these are all different identities that have no connection with each other necessarily. They're social constructs that we learn based off of the society we live in. And what this means for thinking about social oppression, both in our everyday lived experiences as well as within social institutions. And then finally, the other reason why I like to show this to students is because originally this figure was a genderbread man. That was, the author thought was really clever. But actually I had to stop using that imagery because it had been plagiarized. And so the person who made that imagery famous had actually stolen it from the interwebs from somebody else. That came to light, and people don't use it anymore because it was outright plagiarism. And I bring that up as a cautious, friendly reminder. Don't plagiarize. Anyone can do it. Sometimes it's malicious, probably the way this genderbread person did it, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes you accidentally copy and paste something and forget to cite it, or something like that. Just don't do it. Be careful. Proofread the work that you submit. And if you ever have questions about plagiarism, ask me. All right. Finally, here's your exit pass. So you can click on the link here if you're following along with the PowerPoint, or the link is also available on the Week 1 LaLima page. And then in terms of reminders, finish the readings if you haven't already. There are PDFs on LaLima. Everything for this class is available for free, either as a PDF on LaLima or through the UH Manoa Library as an ebook. Watch all the videos on this page. Again, I apologize, there's so many this week. Don't forget to do your discussion board posts responding to one peer, either in a traditional response or through a meme. If you haven't already, sign up for Discussion Leader Project. I went over those details, so I'm not going to elaborate again. And then if you haven't already, submit your signed class agreement by Tuesday at 11:55 p.m. so you don't get reported as a no-show. And that's all I got for you. Have a great week. Bye, everyone.